Hi there, my name is Nick Stevenson. I'm making this short-ish video, which is basically about digitalization and globalization in the 21st century, how that will inevitably affect international and nationalistic or national politics, and cultural identity and work immigration, that sort of thing. Now, it's a particularly interesting time at the moment. We just had the recent referendum. Obviously, we as a nation had voted for Brexit. It's not something that I voted for personally, but people are entitled to have their vote and opinion, which is absolutely fine. So, this is a phenomena, really, and I'm currently sort of in the country. Obviously, we are quite divided. A lot of people have gone to the right, a lot of people have gone to the left, and it's pretty sort of 50-50, really. So, why has this happened? What's going on? Obviously, in times of economic despair, people will either go to the left or the right, and sometimes to the extremities of those, mainly because of the frustrations that they would feel in their own sort of personal lives through the financial challenges that they're facing, which are being created through, the fiscal policy of austerity. So, what does this mean for digitalisation and globalisation? Now, a lot of the people who actually voted for Brexit had done so under the understanding that they were looking to either reduce immigration for various reasons, whether they, feel like their jobs are being taken or undercut by cheap foreign labour, whether that's because they think that the, cultural integrity or identification of Britain is being dissolved through immigration, or it could be just group, or it could just be racist people who just are sort of naturally racist. That's just their sort of neurological structure and belief structure that they have. It's very difficult to actually have some sort of logical or reasoned conversation with these particular group of individuals. The reason being is because that is their belief structure. That's how their brain is neurologically organised to view the world. That's not to say that there isn't, or we don't have elements of neuroplasticity, and that perhaps to some degree those or that particular group of people may be convinced, or their worldview may be you may be able to influence their worldview, but not necessarily to the point of actually changing their fundamental beliefs. But anyway, I digress. So talking about digitalisation and globalisation, how that affects international and national politics. Well, one of the reasons I think that the country is so divided at the moment is because of digitalised network infrastructure that is currently in place, where we are able to source and get information from various different mediums. We suddenly, as individuals, have access to a really wide berth and spectrum of political views. Whereas, sort of if you go back 10, 15 years, initially any sort of information regarding politics would either come from sort of national newspapers, national televisions, and those sorts of things. So they would obviously be, created from a British interest point of view. That's just natural, sort of unconscious bias thing that would take place. However, now what we have is the information that's being absorbed by individuals is being dissipated. Is that right? Is that the right word? And because we have other sources of information that are coming in from all over, whether it's from call it RT or Al Jazeera, that sort of thing, and American news, this and that, and blah blah blah, from all sorts of different countries. All of a sudden, we have access to that information. So how does an individual then make sense or um, be able to um, get a comprehensive and holistic worldview? It's much more difficult because a lot of the time the information that's being received is conflicting. So the semantics um, of the of one's individual belief structure become confused in many ways. So the only way to really make sense of it is to actually acknowledge that that's taking place and make an observation of the different informations which are not necessarily um, making a complete or absolute sense, and that will give us then an actual clearer picture or world view, which I think is something that is being enabled by the digitalization and globalization. So this is what I would consider to be a natural process of human development. In many ways, Russell Brand had sort of talked about this, where there's an awakening, an enlightenment, and so on and so forth. And I think that actually there is some sense in that, because I mean, that doesn't obviously solve the immediate problem of the division that's taken place on a, in a British national level. But it's also taking place, in Spain, in France, and various other sort of regions around Europe. And it's a phenomenon that's not just confined to Europe as well. Obviously, you had the Arab Springs, etc., and other things like that. What does this mean? What does this mean for politics? And how can political institutions adapt to this increasing change? And is Brexit so much a nationalistic view? I think a lot of political groups have actually capitalised on a sentiment of feeling. However, that feeling may not necessarily have been understood from the point of view of the people who were voting, what the feeling actually was. Could it be that it is not necessarily a rejection of the inevitability of globalization and the interconnectedness of digitalization through the sort of global social infrastructures that are now in place, as much as it was a sort of a misunderstanding and not rejection of change, but any time there is change, whatever sort of change it is, there's always sort of great resistance to it. And in many ways, I think that it's possible that expression from the British people, and like I say, sort of various other nations around Europe and other areas, is a fear of the inevitable changes that are taking place within the world that we live in. So what implications does this have for nations and, on an internal political level, and how can they make the adaptation to accommodate the changes that are taking place? And the changes that are taking place will get become greater and faster, and it's just something that we would need to learn to adapt to. And how do we do that? Because it's particularly confusing. So when a nation is, running a particular agenda, let's say, for example, they will get a much greater increase in resistance to those, because the general public will have access to various mediums of information that they have never really before been able to access, and there would be much more informed as well, which makes it difficult for any political organisation, whichever sort of spectrum they're placed on the ideological spectrum. Um, so it's quite interesting. How would one um, be able to quantify that and to actually work with the sort of what would you call it? Um, it's sort of like a inconsistent wave that's it's like a wave but not it's not going in one direction or all that it's going in all directions at once, which is quite interesting really. So how would you do that? How would you be able to manage these changes, and how does that affect international politics? Because if you have national change, that will inevitably have a causality in the terms of an international level, on an international global stage. And it's not something that's going to be unique to individual nations either. Um, it's, it's a global phenomenon. Only countries that would, I suppose, be immune to such rapid change are ones that make, which I would consider, um, unethical controls on the digital infrastructures. But even those can be, penetrated and influenced. And you don't need to be a hacker or hacktivist to sort of understand that. And so, what does that mean in terms of national policy? How does that co-merge with an increasing international policy? Um, because we are becoming more, we're becoming more international, we're becoming more global, even though we voted for, other nations voted for Brexit. Um, and in many ways it's interesting because, like I say, people may have voted for Brexit because they think that the cultural integrity of Britain is being dissolved or whatever. But actually, the global digital infrastructure will influence national cultural identity anyway, and that's not specific to Great Britain, but actually to individual nations, and um, it will it will become diluted globally. It's just going to happen. That's just an inevitability, and we have to recognise that, and we have to now begin to make decisions which are taking that into consideration. Um, and it's the only it's the only way that we will, be able to make any sort of progress as, as as what I would call globalized, or global political um, autonomy almost. But it's interesting, and we'll see how things develop. I'm sure there will be great difficulties before we get to the point which I would predict or envisage. And I have no doubt that there will potentially, if not definitely, be a major war before we reach that point. And the reason for that would possibly be just the mis misinformed politicians trying to resist the inevitable change and to take control of the change that's taking place. But the change that's taking place is not specific to an individual ideology. That's what's interesting. So we'll wait and see what happens. And I suppose, as they say, what will be, will be. Que sera, sera.